My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 34 years old. And 3 months ago at a family dinner, my mother looked me straight in the eyes and said the words that would detonate my entire existence like a carefully placed explosive. You're not really my child anymore. You never were one of us. What she didn't know was that I had been carrying a manila envelope in my purse for exactly 2 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. That envelope contained DNA test results that would expose a decades-old secret and tear apart the carefully constructed facade my family had maintained for over 3 decades. Before I explain what happened when I slid those documents across the dinner table in front of everyone, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And hit that subscribe button if you've ever felt like the black sheep in your own family, because trust me, this story is going somewhere you won't expect. I need to take you back to understand how we arrived at that devastating moment. For my entire life, for every single day of my 34 years on this planet, I have been the outsider in my own family, not the beloved daughter, not the cherished sister, the disappointment, the one who never quite measured up to expectations, who was constantly compared to my golden child, brother Marcus, and found lacking in every possible way. While Marcus could literally do no wrong in our parents' eyes, achieving praise for the smallest accomplishments, I was continuously criticized, systematically overlooked, and deliberately made to feel like an unwelcome guest in my own childhood home. Marcus is 2 years older than me, and from the moment I have conscious memories, he was the sun around which our entire family orbited. When he brought home a B on his report card, it was celebrated with ice cream and enthusiastic phone calls to relatives. When I brought home straight A's, I received a distracted nod and a comment about how grades weren't everything in life. When Marcus played recreational soccer and spent most games picking dandelions in the outfield, my parents attended every single match, cheering wildly from the sidelines. When I made the varsity debate team and won regional competitions, they were always too busy to attend, citing work commitments and prior obligations. The pattern was so consistent, so relentless, that I stopped expecting anything different by the time I reached high school. I learned to celebrate my own victories, privately, to comfort myself after disappointments, to essentially parent myself through adolescence, while my actual parents focused their attention and affection exclusively on Marcus. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was strong enough to handle it, that someday they would see my worth. I was wrong about that last part. The differences in treatment weren't just emotional. They were financial too. Marcus attended an expensive private university, his tuition paid in full by our parents, along with a generous monthly allowance for living expenses, entertainment, and whatever else he wanted. When I graduated high school with honors and a partial scholarship to a state university, my parents informed me that they'd already stretched their budget to its limit with Marcus's education. I would need to figure out my own finances through student loans, part-time jobs, and whatever grants I could secure. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously during college, waiting tables at night, tutoring during the day, and doing freelance graphic design work whenever I could find clients. I graduated with $80,000 in student loan debt and zero financial support from my family. Marcus graduated from law school 2 years later, moved back home rent-free for 3 years while he found himself and figured out his career path, and was eventually gifted a down payment for his first house. I was living in a studio apartment with 3 roommates, eating ramen noodles for dinner most nights, and slowly building my graphic design business from absolutely nothing. The resentment I felt was enormous, but I channeled it into motivation. I would succeed despite them, prove my worth through my own efforts, show them that I didn't need their validation or support. By the time I was 30, my graphic design business was thriving beyond my wildest expectations. I had major corporate clients, a small team of talented employees, and a comfortable 6-figure income. I had paid off my student loans completely through sheer determination and countless 16-hour workdays. I had purchased my own condo in a desirable neighborhood. I had built a life I was genuinely proud of, constructed entirely from my own efforts without a single dollar of family assistance. And that's precisely when my parents started coming to me for money. It began innocuously enough, or so it seemed at the time. Dad called one evening, his voice carrying that particular tone of casual desperation I would come to recognize all too well. They were having some unexpected expenses with the house, he explained. Some necessary repairs that insurance wouldn't cover. Could I possibly loan them $5,000? Just temporarily, of course. They would pay me back within a few months, absolutely. I wanted to believe in family loyalty, wanted to prove that I was the bigger person despite years of neglect, so I transferred the money that same night without hesitation. The repayment never came. Instead, 3 months later, there was another request. Mom's car had died unexpectedly, and she desperately needed a replacement to get to work. Could I help with a down payment? Another $8,000 transferred without question. Then it was Marcus. He'd made some poor financial decisions, overextended himself with credit cards and personal loans. Could his little sister bail him out? The family needed to stick together after all. That request cost me $35,000 to pay off his defaulted law school loans and credit card debt that he'd accumulated buying expensive suits and luxury watches to project success he hadn't actually achieved. Each time, I told myself this was temporary. Each time, I believed their promises of repayment. Each time, I convinced myself that this financial assistance would finally earn me a place at the family table, that they would see my value and contributions, that I would transform from outsider to beloved daughter and sister. I was systematically delusional, buying my way into a family that had no intention of ever truly accepting me. The requests continued with increasing frequency and amounts. The mortgage was behind. Property taxes were due. Medical bills were accumulating. Marcus needed help with his wedding expenses because he'd spent his budget on the engagement ring. Each time, I opened my bank account and transferred whatever they needed, watching my carefully accumulated savings slowly drain away to support a family that gave me nothing in return except continued criticism and comparison. The final tally, when I eventually calculated it with cold precision in a spreadsheet one sleepless night, was staggering and sickening. Over 4 years, I had given my family more than $200,000. $200,000 of my hard-earned money, transferred freely and foolishly to people who couldn't even remember my birthday most years, who never asked about my business or my life, who saw me only as a convenient ATM with a guilty conscience and desperate need for acceptance. And through all of this financial extraction, the emotional dynamics never changed. I remained the disappointment, the outsider, the one who didn't quite belong. Marcus was still the golden child, now a successful attorney with a beautiful wife and a promising career. My contributions were never acknowledged, my sacrifices never recognized. I had purchased exactly nothing except the privilege of continuing to be treated like a second-class family member in my own bloodline. 3 months ago, everything changed in a way I never could have predicted or prepared for. It started with a casual conversation with my best friend Rebecca over coffee at our favorite cafe. She was showing me her results from one of those ancestry DNA tests that had become popular, laughing about discovering she was 12% Scandinavian when she'd always thought her family was entirely Italian. "You should do one," she suggested casually, stirring sugar into her latte. "It's actually pretty interesting seeing the genetic breakdown. Plus, you might discover some distant cousins or something." I ordered the kit that night, primarily out of boredom and mild curiosity, expecting nothing more than confirmation of what I already knew about my European heritage. When the results arrived 6 weeks later, I almost didn't open them immediately. They sat on my kitchen counter for 2 days before I finally logged into the website one evening after a particularly long workday, wine glass in hand, ready to see some percentages and maybe some distant relatives I'd never meet. The genetic breakdown was unremarkable, exactly what I expected from my family background. But there was another section, one I hadn't paid much attention to when I'd submitted the sample. DNA relatives, close family matches. I clicked on it absently, expecting to see maybe some third cousins or distant connections. What I saw instead made my wine glass slip from my fingers and shatter on the kitchen floor. Red liquid spreading across the tile like blood at a crime scene. The closest DNA match was listed as half-sibling with a 25% shared DNA. Marcus Mitchell, my brother. Except according to this test, we weren't full siblings. We were half-siblings, sharing only one biological parent. I sat on my kitchen floor surrounded by broken glass and spilled wine, staring at my phone screen in complete shock, my mind racing through possibilities and implications. Half-sibling. The words repeated in my head like a broken record. How is this possible? Which parent did we share? What did this mean about my entire existence, my entire identity? My hands are trembling as I frantically search through the rest of the DNA matches, looking for answers in the data. My father, Richard Mitchell, showed up as expected with the appropriate percentage for a biological parent. But my mother, Diane Mitchell, was completely absent from the list. Not showing as a parent, not showing as any relation whatsoever. It was as if we shared absolutely no genetic connection at all, despite the fact that I had supposedly emerged from her body 34 years ago in a hospital delivery room. I spent that entire night awake, unable to sleep, my mind spinning with questions and scenarios. Was I adopted and never told? Had there been some hospital mix-up at birth? Was there an affair I knew nothing about? The possibilities consumed me, each one more devastating than the last. By sunrise, I had decided on my course of action. I needed confirmation, needed absolute certainty before I confronted anyone or made any accusations. I ordered 2 additional DNA tests from different companies using expedited processing and submitted my samples that same morning. 3 weeks later, when all 3 tests came back with identical results confirming that I was biologically my father's daughter but shared no genetic connection with my mother, I sat in my condo staring at the paperwork spread across my dining table and felt something fundamental shift inside me. 34 years of feeling like an outsider suddenly made perfect sense in the cruelest possible way. I wasn't imagining the differential treatment, wasn't being overly sensitive about the comparisons to Marcus, wasn't paranoid about feeling unwelcome in my own family. I literally wasn't my mother's biological child, and on some level, she had known this my entire life and had punished me for it every single day. The question that haunted me most insistently was this: did my father know? Had he known all along that I wasn't biologically his wife's daughter? The thought that he might have known, might have watched her treat me as an outsider for decades and said nothing, done nothing to protect me or tell me the truth, filled me with a rage so intense I could barely breathe when I contemplated it. I needed answers, needed the full story before I decided what to do with this information. My grandmother, Helen Mitchell, my father's mother, had passed away the previous year at 87 after a long battle with cancer. In her final weeks, when I visited her in hospice care, she had said something cryptic that I hadn't fully understood at the time. She had held my hand with her frail fingers and whispered, "You were always the strongest one, Sarah. You survived something the rest of them couldn't have endured. Remember that when the truth eventually comes out, because it always does." I had assumed she was speaking metaphorically about my resilience in dealing with my family's treatment of me. Now I wondered if she had been referring to something far more specific, far more concrete. I spent an entire weekend going through the boxes of her belongings that my father had given me after her death. Things he said she'd specifically wanted me to have. Photo albums, old letters, her jewelry box, several books. I had glanced through them briefly when I first received them, touched by her thoughtfulness, but not examining anything too closely because the grief was still too fresh and overwhelming. This time, I went through everything with desperate, meticulous attention to detail. And that's when I found it, tucked inside her copy of Pride and Prejudice, her favorite novel. An envelope addressed to me in her distinctive handwriting, marked to be opened when you're ready to know. My hand shook so badly I could barely tear it open without ripping the contents inside. The letter was dated 6 months before her death, written in the shaky handwriting of someone whose body was failing but whose mind remained perfectly clear and sharp. "My dearest Sarah," it began, and I had to stop reading several times because tears blurred my vision and made the words swim on the page. "If you're reading this, then you've likely discovered the truth about your parentage through modern science or simply through questions that finally demanded answers. I've known since you were born that this day would eventually come, and I'm both relieved and heartbroken that I won't be there to help you through it." She went on to explain everything with painful honesty and detail. My mother had an affair with Richard Thornton, my father's business partner at the architectural firm they co-founded in their 30s. The affair lasted approximately 6 months during a period when my parents' marriage was struggling, when my father was traveling extensively for work and my mother felt neglected and lonely. When she became pregnant with me, she initially assumed the baby was my father's, or at least she claimed to. But when I was born looking nothing like Marcus, who had inherited both parents' dark hair and brown eyes, with my light blonde hair and striking green eyes that matched neither parent, questions arose immediately in the hospital delivery room. According to my grandmother's letter, my mother's own mother, my maternal grandmother who died when I was 6, pulled my mother aside shortly after my birth and confronted her directly about the affair she suspected. Under pressure and consumed with guilt, my mother eventually confessed to my father when I was approximately 2 years old, admitting that she'd had the affair and that there was a significant possibility I wasn't biologically his daughter. My father, rather than leave the marriage immediately and create a scandal that would destroy his business partnership and social standing, made a devastating choice. He agreed to stay, to raise me as his daughter, to keep the secret buried, but only if my mother agreed to his terms. Those terms, as outlined in my grandmother's letter with disgust evident in every word, were calculated and cruel. My mother would treat me differently than Marcus, would maintain emotional distance, would make it clear through subtle and not so subtle ways that I was separate from the family. Different, not quite one of them. This would serve as her punishment for the affair, her constant reminder of her betrayal, and would discourage me from ever feeling too entitled to family resources or inheritance that my father felt should rightfully go to Marcus, his biological son. It was a twisted arrangement that prioritized reputation and financial considerations over my well-being, that sacrificed my childhood and emotional health to maintain appearances and protect adult egos. My grandmother had been furious when she discovered this arrangement, confronting my father multiple times over the years, threatening to tell me the truth herself. But my father convinced her that the truth would only hurt me more, would devastate me, would destroy any chance I had at a normal family life. He promised he would tell me himself when I was older, when I was mature enough to handle it. That day never came. Year after year, he found reasons to maintain the lie, to keep me in the dark, to let his wife punish me daily for a sin I hadn't committed while he stood by and watched, doing the bare minimum to maintain plausible deniability about his own complicity. "I should have told you myself," my grandmother wrote near the end of her letter. "I should have defied your father and given you the truth years ago so you could make informed choices about these people and their treatment of you. Instead, I was a coward and I let you suffer unnecessarily. I hope you can forgive me, though I don't deserve it. More importantly, I hope you will finally put yourself first. Stop trying to earn love from people who have proven incapable of giving it, and build a life surrounded by people who see your true value. You owe them nothing, Sarah. Not loyalty, not money, not another moment of your precious time. Walk away and don't look back." I read that letter 17 times that day, memorizing every word, every detail, every piece of the puzzle that finally made my entire life make sense. The differential treatment wasn't in my imagination. The financial exploitation wasn't just family dynamics. The constant criticism and comparison wasn't about motivating me to improve. It was all punishment, all calculated cruelty designed to keep me in my place, to remind me that I was tainted, illegitimate, unworthy of full acceptance into a family that I'd done nothing wrong to have the misfortune of being born from my mother's betrayal. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I had ever experienced before in my life. Not hot, explosive anger, but cold, calculating fury that crystallized into absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. I wasn't going to confront them privately, wasn't going to give them the opportunity to spin the narrative, to gaslight me into doubting the evidence, to manipulate me into keeping their secret to protect their reputations. They had spent 34 years making me feel small and unworthy. It was time they experienced what public exposure and accountability actually felt like. I hired a lawyer the following week, one who specialized in family law and financial disputes. I brought her everything: the DNA tests from multiple companies, my grandmother's letter, detailed financial records of every dollar I'd transferred to my family over the past 4 years, bank statements, Venmo transactions, screenshots of text message requests for money, email chains discussing loans that were never repaid. I had documented everything compulsively over the years, initially just for my own record keeping, never imagining it would become evidence in a legal case against my own family. "This is substantial," my lawyer, Amanda Chin, said after reviewing everything I'd provided over 3 hours in her office. "You have a very strong case for recovering the loans, especially given that you have written requests and promises of repayment that were never fulfilled. The DNA evidence and her grandmother's letter provide important context for understanding the family dynamics and potential fraud or undue influence in obtaining these loans from you." We spent several more meetings developing a strategy. I would formally demand repayment of all loans with reasonable interest calculated at the standard legal rate. I would give them 60 days to respond and make arrangements for repayment. If they refused or ignored the demand, which Amanda predicted they would, we would file a civil lawsuit seeking full repayment plus court costs and legal fees. The DNA evidence and the story of my differential treatment would be relevant to establishing that I had been exploited and manipulated specifically because of my outsider status in the family, making the loans products of undue influence rather than freely given gifts. But before any of that legal machinery started moving forward, I had one thing I needed to do first. I needed to look them in the eyes as a family and tell them that I knew the truth, that their decades-long deception was over, that I was done being their scapegoat and their ATM. I needed them to understand that the power dynamic had shifted permanently and irreversibly, that the daughter and sister they'd systematically undervalued had figured out their ugly secret and was prepared to burn down their carefully constructed world of lies. The annual family dinner was scheduled for the following month, a tradition my mother insisted on maintaining every year to celebrate Marcus's latest achievement, whatever that happened to be. This year it was his promotion to junior partner at his law firm, a position he'd attained partly through his own work, but mostly through connections my parents had carefully cultivated on his behalf. The dinner would be held at my parents' house, the same house I'd helped them save from foreclosure with my money, with the extended family in attendance: Aunt Carol, Uncle Tom's several cousins, Marcus, and his wife Jennifer. I confirmed my attendance cheerfully when my mother texted me the details, offering to bring dessert, as I always did, playing the role of the dutiful daughter one final time. I even went shopping for the event, purchasing a new dress and getting my hair styled professionally, wanting to look my absolute best for what would be the most important performance of my life. I had the DNA test results printed on official letterhead from all 3 testing companies, placed in a crisp manila envelope. I had my grandmother's letter, carefully preserved in a protective sleeve. I had printed spreadsheets showing every financial transaction, every loan, every promise of repayment that never materialized. The night of the dinner, I arrived precisely on time, carrying an expensive dessert from the French bakery my mother loved and the manila envelope in my designer purse. The house was filled with the familiar sounds of family gathering: my mother's forced laughter, my father's stories about his golf game, Marcus holding court in the living room, while Jennifer nodded adoringly at everything he said, my aunt and uncle discussing their recent vacation to Europe. I played my role perfectly that evening, smiling and nodding in all the right places, complimenting Jennifer on her new jewelry, listening to Uncle Tom's boring work stories with feigned interest, helping my mother in the kitchen, even though she barely acknowledged my presence. I was setting the stage, waiting for the perfect moment, letting them all settle into their comfortable assumptions about family hierarchy and my place at the bottom of it. Dinner was served promptly at 7. My mother's signature pot roast with all the traditional sides arranged beautifully on her best china. We took our usual seats around the large dining table, the same seats we'd occupied for years, my parents at the head and foot of the table, Marcus and Jennifer on one side positioned closest to my mother, me relegated to the far end, next to Aunt Carol. The seating arrangement itself a physical manifestation of family priorities and affections. The conversation flowed exactly as it always did during these gatherings, like a script we'd all memorized through countless repetitions. Marcus dominated the discussion, talking at length about his promotion, the important cases he was working on, the senior partners who were impressed with his work, his plans for making junior partner within record time. My parents listened with rapt attention, asking detailed follow-up questions, praising his intelligence and work ethic, predicting even greater success in his future. "You've always been destined for greatness," my mother said, reaching over to squeeze Marcus's hand affectionately, her eyes shining with genuine pride and maternal love that I'd never once seen directed at me. "Ever since you were a little boy, your father and I knew you were special, that you were going to accomplish extraordinary things." Marcus accepted the praise with practiced humility that didn't quite mask his obvious pleasure at being the center of attention. "I've had great role models," he said smoothly, nodding toward our parents. Learning from the best made all the difference. Jennifer chimed in with her own adoring commentary about her brilliant husband, and Uncle Tom offered congratulations, and Aunt Carol asked questions about the law firm, and the conversation continued to revolve entirely around Marcus's achievements and future prospects. I sat quietly, methodically eating my pot roast, waiting and watching, my purse with its explosive contents sitting innocuously beside my chair. Finally, after about 30 minutes of this relentless, Marcus-focused discussion, there was a brief lull in the conversation as everyone concentrated on their food. My mother turned to me almost as an afterthought, remembering suddenly that I was present at the table. "And Sarah, how is your little graphic design business going? Still keeping busy with projects?" The word little was deliberate, diminishing, a subtle reminder that whatever I did couldn't possibly compare to Marcus's legitimate law career. I had heard variations of this dismissive description for years. The way she always minimized my professional success, made it sound like a hobby rather than the thriving business it actually was. "Actually, it's going extremely well," I said calmly, setting down my fork. I had just secured a major contract with a Fortune 500 company, the largest client we've ever landed. It will likely double our revenue this year. My mother nodded vaguely, her expression unchanging, clearly uninterested. "That's nice, dear. Though I suppose with your particular skill set, that's about what we'd expect." Before I could respond or elaborate, she immediately pivoted back to Marcus. "Speaking of major achievements, Marcus, tell everyone about that pro bono case you mentioned last week. The one helping those underprivileged children." And just like that, I was dismissed, my significant professional accomplishment acknowledged with 3 words, and immediately overshadowed by redirecting attention back to Marcus. It was such a perfectly typical interaction, such a clear demonstration of the family dynamic, that I almost laughed out loud at the timing. They were making this easier than I'd anticipated. Marcus launched into a detailed and somewhat self-aggrandizing story about his charitable legal work, positioning himself as a hero fighting for justice, conveniently omitting the part where such pro bono cases were mandatory at his firm, and he'd complained to me privately about having to waste his time on unpaid work. Everyone listened attentively, offering appropriate praise and admiration at the right moments, performing their assigned roles in the family theater. Then Marcus made a comment that provided the perfect opening, the exact moment I'd been waiting for. He was discussing opposing counsel in one of his cases, describing them as incompetent and lacking natural talent for legal strategy. Some people just aren't cut out for high-level professional work, he said, taking a sip of his expensive wine. It requires a certain intellectual capacity, natural instincts that you either have or you don't. He glanced in my direction with barely concealed condescension, the implication clear to everyone at the table. I was one of those people lacking in natural talent, someone operating at a lower level, incapable of his kind of professional excellence. It was an insult wrapped in general commentary, plausibly deniable but unmistakably directed at me. My mother laughed, that particular tinkling laugh she used when Marcus said something she found clever. "Well, talent does run in the family," she said, looking directly at me now with something cold and calculated in her eyes. "Though I suppose not everyone got the same genes. Some people are just naturally gifted, destined for success, while others have to work much harder for lesser results." The table had gone quiet, everyone recognizing the tension suddenly crackling in the air. Dad stared down at his plate, his jaw tight, saying nothing as he always did when my mother took these verbal shots at me. Aunt Carol looked uncomfortable, shifting in her seat. Uncle Tom concentrated very intently on his green beans. Jennifer watched with barely disguised interest, enjoying the drama. My mother wasn't finished. She set down her wine glass with deliberate precision, her expression hardening into something openly hostile, the mask of maternal civility finally slipping completely. "Sarah, you're not really my child anymore," she said, her voice cold and sharp like a blade cutting through the false warmth of family dinner. "You never were one of us. I think it's time we all stopped pretending otherwise." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, devastating in their cruelty and finality. This was it. The moment I'd been waiting for, though even in my preparations I hadn't quite anticipated she would be this explicit, this brutal, this willing to say out loud what she'd demonstrated through actions for 34 years. Dad's fork clattered against his plate. Marcus's eyes widened slightly before his expression settled into that familiar smirk, clearly enjoying my public humiliation. Aunt Carol gasped audibly. I felt the familiar rush of shame and hurt that I'd experienced countless times growing up, that instinctive emotional response to parental rejection that's hardwired into children from birth. My hands wanted to shake. My eyes wanted to fill with tears. My voice wanted to break. Every part of me that had been conditioned over decades to accept this treatment, to absorb the cruelty and internalize it as deserved, was screaming at me to run from the room, to hide, to make myself small and invisible as I'd done so many times before. But I wasn't that person anymore. I wasn't the lost child desperate for scraps of affection. I wasn't the young woman who believed if she just gave enough money, achieved enough success, proved her worth sufficiently, she would finally be accepted and loved. I was someone who knew the truth, who had evidence and documentation, who had a lawyer on retainer and a plan of action. I was someone who had nothing left to lose because I'd finally understood I'd never actually had what I thought I was risking. Instead of crying or running away like they clearly expected, like they wanted, I calmly reached down beside my chair and retrieved my purse. I pulled out the manila envelope with movements that were slow and deliberate, letting the anticipation build, letting them wonder what I was doing. The table watched in confused silence as I placed the envelope on the table in front of me, my hands perfectly steady now, my voice about to be clear and strong. "Funny you should mention jeans, Mom," I said, and I was almost impressed by how calm I sounded, how controlled, like I was discussing the weather rather than detonating their entire world. "Because I took a DNA test 3 months ago. Out of curiosity initially, just one of those ancestry things everyone does now. But the results were quite interesting." I opened the envelope and pulled out the first set of documents, the official results from 23andMe printed on their letterhead with all the technical details and genetic markers clearly visible. I slid them across the table toward my mother, watching her face carefully, savoring this moment I'd rehearsed in my mind hundreds of times. According to 23andMe and 2 other independent testing services I used to confirm the results because I wanted to be absolutely certain I'm not your biological daughter, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, more confident, carrying across the silent room like a bell. But here's the really interesting part that I think you'll find particularly relevant to this conversation. I am Dad's biological daughter. Full genetic match. No question whatsoever. The reaction was immediate and spectacular. My mother's face drained of all color, going from flushed pink to stark white in seconds. Dad's fork, which he'd just picked up again, dropped from his fingers and clattered loudly against his plate. Marcus stopped mid-sip of his wine, the glass frozen halfway to his mouth, his expression shifting from smug superiority to complete shock. Jennifer's mouth literally fell open. Aunt Carol made a choking sound. Uncle Tom's eyes darted between me and my parents like he was watching a tennis match. I wasn't finished. I'd waited 34 years for this moment, and I was going to deliver every single piece of information I'd carefully gathered and verified. I pulled out the second and third sets of DNA results from the other testing companies, spreading them across the table like evidence in a trial, which in a sense this was. I had the results verified by 2 additional DNA testing services because I needed to be absolutely certain before I said anything. I continued methodically. Ancestry DNA and MyHeritage both confirmed the identical results. I am biologically related to Dad with appropriate genetic markers for a father-daughter relationship. I share 0 genetic connection with you, Mom. None. According to the science, which doesn't lie, you're not my biological mother despite the fact that I apparently emerged from your body 34 years ago. My mother tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but no words emerged. She reached across the table with shaking hands, trying to grab the papers, trying to hide the evidence from everyone's view. But I was faster. I pulled them back smoothly, holding them just out of her reach. I wouldn't do that if I were you, I said quietly. These are just copies. I have the originals locked safely away with my attorney, along with everything else I'm about to share. Dad finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a hoarse whisper. Sarah, this isn't the time or place for this discussion. We should talk about this privately as a family. I laughed, and the sound surprised even me. It was cold, hollow, completely devoid of humor. As a family? That's rich, Dad. Mom just announced everyone at this table that I'm not part of this family, that I never was. So I'd say this is exactly the right time and place to discuss why that statement is actually biologically accurate. I pulled out the next document, my grandmother's letter, still in its protective sleeve. After I got the DNA results, I did some digging. I talked to Grandma Helen before she passed last year. Actually, that's not quite accurate. She left me a letter, specifically addressed to me, to be opened when I was ready to know the truth. She knew I'd figure it out eventually. I held up the letter so everyone could see it, see Grandma Helen's distinctive handwriting on the envelope. Apparently, Mom had an affair with Richard Thornton, Dad's business partner. You remember Richard, right? He moved to California about 30 years ago, right around the time I was born. That timing wasn't a coincidence. The table erupted in chaos. Aunt Carol gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth. Uncle Tom's eyes went wide with shock and something like fascination. Jennifer was openly staring now, her phone out on her lap under the table, and I could see her fingers moving. She was almost certainly texting someone about this unfolding drama. Marcus had gone very pale. His earlier smugness completely evaporated. My mother finally found her voice, shrill and desperate. You have no right to discuss private family matters like this. This is ancient history, nobody's business, and you're airing it out like common gossip. Private, I said, my voice rising slightly. You just declared in front of everyone here that I'm not your child, that I never was part of this family. You made it public, Mom. I'm just providing the context and explanation. The truth that you've been hiding for 34 years while treating me like an outsider, like I deserve to be punished for something I had no control over. I pulled out Grandma Helen's letter from the protective sleeve and began reading selected portions aloud, my voice steady despite the emotion, threatening to overwhelm me. Grandma wrote, "Your mother had an affair with Richard Thornton when your parents' marriage was struggling. When you were born and looked nothing like Marcus, questions arose immediately. Your maternal grandmother confronted your mother, who eventually confessed to your father when you were 2 years old." Dad had his head in his hands now, elbows on the table, clearly wishing he could disappear. Marcus was staring at him with an expression I couldn't quite read. Betrayal, confusion, anger, maybe all three at once. I continued reading. "Your father made a choice that I will never forgive him for. He agreed to stay in the marriage to avoid scandal and protect his business partnership with Richard, but only under certain conditions. Your mother would treat you differently than Marcus, maintain emotional distance, make it clear you were separate from the family. This was her punishment for the affair, and your father's way of ensuring you wouldn't feel entitled to family resources he believed should go to Marcus, his biological son." The words landed like bombs across the table, each revelation detonating its own explosion of shock and understanding. Aunt Carol was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "Eleanor, how could you?" she whispered to my mother. "She was just a child, an innocent child." "You don't understand," my mother said desperately, her composure completely shattered. "It was complicated. The marriage was falling apart. Richard was there. He listened. He made me feel valued when your father was never home. It wasn't supposed to happen, and when I found out I was pregnant, I genuinely thought she was Richard's." "You thought?" I said, my voice sharp. "So, you weren't even sure, and you still let Dad raise me while punishing me every single day of my life for your mistake? For your choices?" Dad finally looked up. His face aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. His eyes were red, whether from shame or suppressed tears I couldn't tell. "I tried, Sarah. I know it doesn't seem like it, but I did try to protect you where I could. I wanted to tell you the truth when you were older, but the time never seemed right, and the longer I waited, the harder it became." "You tried," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You watched her treat me like garbage for 34 years, and you call that trying? You let her make me feel worthless, unwanted, like I had to earn every scrap of basic human decency, while Marcus got unconditional love and support. That's not trying, Dad. That's being a coward." Marcus finally spoke, his voice strained. "So you're saying I'm the only actual child in this family? That Sarah is what? A half-sister?" "Biologically, yes," I confirmed. "We share a father, but not a mother. Though I'd say the way you've treated me over the years suggests you figured out I was different long before I did." He had the decency to look uncomfortable, at least. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I swear I didn't know about any of this." "Maybe not the specifics," I allowed. "But you definitely knew you were the favorite, that the rules were different for you, that you could do no wrong while I could do no right. You benefited from this sick dynamic just as much as they perpetuated it." My mother was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks in black streaks. "What do you want from me, Sarah? An apology for something that happened before you could even remember? For choices I made when I was young and stupid and desperate?" "An apology would be a start," I said, "but it wouldn't begin to address the real issue here, which brings me to the next part of what I need to discuss." I pulled out my final stack of documents, the detailed financial records I'd compiled with obsessive thoroughness over the past month. Bank statements, transfer receipts, Venmo transaction histories, text message screenshots, email chains. Everything organized chronologically and categorized by type. "For the past 4 years," I said, laying the documents across the table methodically, "I have been financing this family's lifestyle and bailing you out of your financial mistakes. I have detailed records of every single dollar I transferred, every loan I made, every request for help that was framed as temporary but turned out to be permanent." I started reading from my summary page. September 2019. $5,000 for emergency home repairs that Dad said insurance wouldn't cover. No repayment. December 2019. $8,000 for Mom's car down payment. No repayment. March 2020. $35,000 to pay off Marcus's defaulted law school loans and credit card debt. No repayment. Marcus's face went red. That was a private matter between siblings, he protested weakly. Nothing is private anymore, I said. You all made sure of that when Mom announced I wasn't family. So let's talk about everything. May 2020. $15,000 for mortgage arrears to prevent foreclosure. August 2020. $12,000 for property taxes. November 2020. $8,000 for medical bills. February 2021. $25,000 for Marcus's wedding expenses after he overspent on Jennifer's engagement ring. Jennifer looked shocked. You paid for part of our wedding? Marcus told me his parents covered everything. He lied, I said simply. Just like everyone at this table has been lying to me my entire life. April 2021. $20,000 for Mom's debt consolidation. July 2021. $18,000 for Dad's business loan payment. October 2021. $10,000 for this house's new roof. January 2022. $15,000 for Marcus's new car down payment because the lease on his previous car was up and he couldn't afford the payments he'd committed to. I looked up from my papers at my brother. You told me that loan would be paid back within 6 months. You said you'd just gotten a bonus and were waiting for it to clear. That was over a year ago. I haven't seen a single dollar returned. The list continued, transaction after transaction, broken promise after broken promise. Aunt Carol was staring at my parents with undisguised horror. You've been taking that much money from her while treating her like this, she said, her voice shaking. That's unconscionable. That's financial abuse. The total, I said, flipping to my final summary page, is $213,847. Over 4 years, I gave this family more than $200,000 of my hard-earned money. Money I made building a business from nothing while working 3 jobs through college because you couldn't be bothered to help pay for my education like you did for Marcus. Money I earned through 16-hour days and sacrificed vacations and delayed buying my own home. The number hung in the air, staggering in its magnitude. I watched the realization dawn on their faces, the understanding of just how much they'd taken from me while giving nothing in return. Every single time I transferred money, you promised it was temporary, I continued. Every single time you said you'd pay me back. Every single time. I believed you because I desperately wanted to believe that if I just helped enough, gave enough, proved my value enough, you would finally see me as part of this family. I was buying my way in, and you were happy to take my money while still treating me like I didn't belong. Dad was crying now, silent tears running down his face. Sarah, I'm so sorry. We never meant for it to become so much. Things just kept happening. Expenses kept coming up, and you were always so generous. Generous, I said, my voice rising. I wasn't being generous, Dad. I was being desperate. Desperate for acceptance, for approval, for some sign that I mattered to you people. And you exploited that desperation for years. My mother had stopped crying and was now looking at me with something like calculation in her eyes. What exactly do you want, Sarah? Are you going to hold this over our heads forever? Use it to manipulate us? Manipulate you? I said incredulously. That's rich coming from someone who's been manipulating me my entire life. No, Mom, I'm not here to manipulate anyone. I'm here to inform you of what happens next. I pulled out the final document, a formal legal letter on my attorney's letterhead. I hired a lawyer last week. Her name is Amanda Chin, and she specializes in family law and financial disputes. This letter is a formal demand for repayment of all loans made to family members over the past 4 years, with interest calculated at the standard legal rate. I slid the letter across the table toward my parents, watching as my father picked it up with trembling hands and began reading, his face growing paler with each line. You have 60 days from the date of this letter to respond and make arrangements for repayment, I continued, my voice businesslike now detached. If you refuse, ignore the demand, or fail to make satisfactory arrangements, I will file a civil lawsuit seeking full repayment plus court costs, legal fees, and damages. Marcus grabbed the letter from Dad's hands, scanning it quickly, his legal training immediately recognizing the serious nature of the document. You can't be serious about this, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. This is family money. These were gifts, not loans. They weren't gifts, I said firmly. I have documentation proving they were loans. Text messages where you specifically said you'd pay me back. Emails where Mom promised repayment within months. Voice messages where Dad discussed payment arrangements. Every single transaction was framed as a temporary loan, not a gift. My attorney has reviewed everything, and she's confident we have an exceptionally strong case. I pulled out my phone and opened my messages, turning the screen so everyone could see. Here's a text from you, Marcus, from January 2022 when I sent you $15,000 for your car. You wrote, Thanks, sis. I'll pay you back as soon as my bonus clears in March. Definitely won't forget this. It's November now. 20 months later. No payment, no follow-up, nothing. Just silence and continued expectation that I'd keep being your personal bank. I scrolled to another message. Here's Mom from May 2020. Sarah, honey, we desperately need $15,000 for the mortgage or we'll lose the house. We'll pay you back over the next year, I promise. You know we're good for it. That was 3.5 years ago. Still waiting on that repayment. Jennifer was staring at Marcus with an expression that suggested this conversation would continue long after they left my parents' house. You told me we paid cash for your car, she said quietly. You said you'd saved up. There's a lot he didn't tell you, I said. A lot they've all hidden behind closed doors while maintaining appearances. But I'm done protecting their secrets and their reputations at the expense of my own well-being and financial security. Aunt Carol cleared her throat, her voice thick with emotion. Sarah, I had no idea any of this was happening. The money, the lies about your parentage, any of it. If I had known, I would have said something years ago. This is absolutely unacceptable. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. Aunt Carol had always been kind to me, one of the few family members who treated me with basic respect and interest. This isn't about you or Uncle Tom. This is specifically about the people who created this situation and have perpetuated it for decades. My mother had regained some of her composure, her face hardening into familiar lines of defensiveness and deflection. So this is revenge? You're going to destroy this family over money and ancient history? You're going to sue your own parents, make everything public and humiliating, because you're angry about things that happened before you could even walk. This isn't revenge, I said, though part of me knew that wasn't entirely true. This is accountability. For the first time in 34 years, you're going to face actual consequences for your choices. You don't get to treat me like garbage, exploit me financially, maintain a decades-long deception, and then act shocked when I finally stand up for myself. I stood up from the table, gathering my documents back into the manila envelope with deliberate care. The legal demand stands. 60 days to respond with a repayment plan. My attorney's contact information is on the letter. I suggest you get your own lawyer, because Amanda doesn't think you'll pay voluntarily, and she's prepared to take this to court. Dad finally stood as well, reaching toward me desperately. Sarah, please, can we talk about this privately? Just you and me? I know I failed you. I know I made terrible choices, but please don't do this. Don't tear the family apart. I looked at him for a long moment, this man who was biologically my father but had never truly been a dad in any meaningful sense. You tore this family apart 32 years ago when you made that agreement with Mom," I said quietly. "When you chose your reputation and your business partnership over protecting an innocent child. When you decided it was acceptable to let your wife punish a toddler for her own mistakes. I'm not tearing anything apart. I'm just finally refusing to hold together something that was broken from the beginning." I turned to Marcus, who was still staring at the legal letter like it might spontaneously combust. "You asked earlier if I was serious about this. Let me be crystal clear. I have never been more serious about anything in my entire life. You're a lawyer. You understand contract law and promissory obligations. You know I have a case. So you can either take this seriously and work with my attorney to arrange repayment, or you can find out exactly how serious I am when we're all sitting in a courtroom." Marcus swallowed hard but said nothing. There wasn't anything he could say that would change the reality of the situation. He'd made promises he hadn't kept, accepted money under false pretenses, and now those choices were coming back to haunt him in the most public possible way. My mother made one final attempt at manipulation, her voice taking on that wounded, martyred quality she'd perfected over the years. "After everything we did for you, we gave you a home, food, an education, a family name. We didn't have to keep you when we found out the truth. We could have sent you to foster care, but we chose to raise you as our own. And this is how you repay that kindness." The audacity of that statement, the sheer, twisted logic of it, almost took my breath away. "Kindness," I repeated, my voice dangerously soft. "You call what you did to me kindness. You kept me so you could punish me daily for your own guilt. You kept me so you'd have a convenient scapegoat and a visible reminder of your mistake. You kept me because giving me up would have required explaining why, and that would have exposed your affair and destroyed your precious reputation." I looked around the table at all of them, these people who share my blood but had never truly been my family. "I don't owe you gratitude for the bare minimum of not abandoning a child to foster care. I don't owe you anything except the honesty you never gave me. And the honest truth is this: you're not good people. You're not a loving family. You're manipulative, selfish people who exploited a child's natural need for parental love and acceptance for your own purposes." I picked up my purse and the manila envelope, preparing to leave. "Oh, and one more thing," I said, remembering the final detail. "I paid for this dinner tonight. I paid for the last 12 family dinners, actually. I've been Venmo ING Mom money to cover the costs because she complained about hosting being expensive. So that ends now, too. From this point forward, you're on your own financially. Every single automatic transfer, every standing arrangement, every emergency fund I maintained for your crises, all of it stops today." I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, and right there at the table, in front of everyone, I canceled the recurring transfers I'd set up for their mortgage assistance, their utility help, all of it. "Consider this your official notice that the Bank of Sarah is permanently closed." Jennifer, who had been mostly silent throughout this entire confrontation, finally spoke up. "Marcus, I think we should go. This is clearly a family matter that doesn't concern us." "It does concern you, actually," I said to her directly. "You should know that the house you're living in, the one Marcus told you he bought with his law firm bonus, I provided the down payment, $45,000. You might want to ask your husband about that on the drive home." Marcus's face went crimson with embarrassment and rage. "You're really going to destroy everything, aren't you? Every relationship, every connection, everything we've built together as a family." "What did we build together, Marcus?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Name one thing we built together that wasn't built on lies, exploitation, and my desperate need for acceptance that you all manipulated ruthlessly. One thing where I was treated as an equal partner, a valued family member, someone whose contributions were appreciated rather than expected and dismissed." He couldn't. None of them could. The silence that followed my question was answer enough. I walked toward the door and Dad followed me, his footsteps heavy and defeated. "Sarah," he said one more time as I reached for the doorknob. "I tried. I really did try to protect you in the ways I could. I gave you the business skills, taught you about finances, encouraged your independence. I thought I was preparing you to be strong enough to survive without us." I turned to look at him one final time. "You did teach me to be strong, Dad. Strong enough to finally walk away from people who were slowly destroying me. Strong enough to demand respect instead of begging for scraps of affection. Strong enough to choose myself for the first time in 34 years. So thank you for that, I suppose. It's probably the only valuable thing you ever gave me." His face crumpled, and for a moment I felt a flicker of sympathy for this broken man who'd made terrible choices that poisoned everything they touched. But sympathy wasn't enough to make me stay, wasn't enough to make me accept another day of this toxic dynamic. "You have 60 days, I repeated. "My attorney will be in touch. I suggest you take this seriously." I walked out the door and down the front steps to my car, my hand steady, my head clear, my heart strangely light despite the devastation I'd just unleashed. Behind me, I could hear raised voices as the family erupted into arguments and recriminations now that I was gone. Let them fight among themselves. Let them blame each other. Let them experience what it felt like when family turned against family. They'd been doing it to me for decades. Now they could do it to each other. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. I had burned every bridge, exposed every secret, declared war on the only family I'd ever known. There was no going back from this moment. The relationships, such as they were permanently destroyed. Any possibility of reconciliation or healing was gone, incinerated in the fire of truth and accountability I deliberately set. And yet I felt free, truly free for the first time in my adult life, free from the desperate need to prove my worth to people incapable of seeing it, free from the financial exploitation that had drained my resources and delayed my own dreams, free from the emotional manipulation that had kept me running on a treadmill of seeking approval that would never come. I had finally stepped off the treadmill, and the ground beneath my feet felt solid and real in a way it never had before. My phone buzzed with incoming texts. One from Aunt Carol. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I had no idea. You did the right thing. Call me if you need anything." One from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Jennifer. Thank you for finally telling the truth. Marcus, and I need to have a serious conversation." Nothing from my parents or Marcus yet. They were probably still too shocked, still processing, still trying to figure out how to spin this to minimize their culpability and paint me as the villain. Let them try. I had documentation, I had evidence, I had the truth on my side. I started my car and drove away from that house, and as I watched it disappear in my rearview mirror, I realized something profound. That house had never been home. Home was supposed to be a place of safety, acceptance, unconditional love. That house had been a battlefield where I fought daily for basic human dignity and always lost. Leaving it behind wasn't a loss. It was liberation. The following weeks were chaotic, exactly as Amanda had predicted. My parents hired their own attorney, who sent strongly worded letters claiming the money had been gifts, that I couldn't prove otherwise, that family disputes shouldn't be resolved through litigation. Amanda demolished their arguments with extensive documentation I'd provided, the clear evidence of loan agreements and promises of repayment that had never materialized. Marcus tried calling several times, his messages oscillating between anger and attempted guilt trips. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said at that dinner table. Jennifer, surprisingly, reached out and we met for coffee. She was filing for separation from Marcus. She told me the lies about the house down payment were just the beginning of financial deceptions she discovered once she started looking. She thanked me for opening her eyes, though I could see the pain and betrayal in her face. I felt sorry for her. She'd married into this family thinking She was getting something different than what they actually were. Aunt Carol became an unexpected ally, corroborating what she knew about the family dynamics and offering to testify if the case went to trial about the differential treatment she'd witnessed over the years. Uncle Tom quietly sent me a check for $5,000 with a note. "This isn't about the lawsuit. This is because we should have spoken up years ago about how they treated you. I'm sorry we stayed silent." The 60 days passed with no satisfactory response from my parents. They offered to pay back $20,000 over 5 years, a laughably inadequate proposal that insulted both my intelligence and my attorney's patience. Amanda filed the lawsuit on day 61, and suddenly it was all very real and very public. Court documents became public record. Their financial exploitation, the DNA evidence, Grandma Helen's letter, all of it laid out in legal filings that anyone could access. The lawsuit moved slowly through the system, as these things always do. But Amanda was confident. "They're going to settle," she predicted after the first hearing. "They don't want this going to trial where everything becomes even more public. Their reputation in the community matters to them, and a trial would destroy what's left of it." She was right. 3 weeks before the scheduled trial date, their attorney reached out with a settlement offer. Full repayment of the $213,847 plus interest, and my legal fees, paid out over 3 years with the house as collateral. In exchange, I would sign a non-disclosure agreement about the family matters that had led to the financial exploitation. I refused the NDA immediately. "I'm not protecting their secrets anymore," I told Amanda firmly. That's how they maintained control for so long, by making sure no one outside the family knew what was really happening. "I'll accept the repayment terms, but I won't sign away my right to tell my own story." We negotiated for another week before reaching a final agreement. Full repayment with interest and legal fees, no NDA, but an agreement that I wouldn't proactively seek media attention about the case. I could tell my story if asked, could discuss it with friends and family, could write about it or speak about it in any forum I chose, but I wouldn't take out ads or hold press conferences specifically to damage their reputation. It was a compromise I could live with. The settlement was finalized on a gray Tuesday morning in a conference room that smelled of stale coffee and old carpet. My parents looked 10 years older than they had at that dinner table, worn down by months of legal stress and community judgment. We didn't speak beyond the necessary legal formalities. There was nothing left to say. When I walked out of that conference room with a signed settlement agreement, I felt a chapter of my life close with finality. The money would be repaid, slowly but surely. Justice, at least financial justice, had been served. But more important than the money was what I'd reclaimed. My dignity, my truth, my right to set boundaries and demand respect. If you've made it this far in my story, thank you for listening. Thank you for witnessing what happened when a family's decades of secrets and exploitation finally came to light. If you've ever felt like an outsider in your own family, if you've ever given too much to people who gave nothing back, if you've ever discovered truths that changed everything you thought you knew about your life, I see you. You're not alone. Drop a comment below telling me your thoughts on this whole situation. Was I right to expose everything at that dinner? Should I have handled it differently? Have you ever had to cut ties with family members for your own well-being? I genuinely want to hear your perspectives and experiences. And please hit that like button if this story resonated with you. And subscribe to this channel because I'll be sharing updates as I continue rebuilding my life on my own terms, surrounded by people who actually value and respect me. The last thing I'll say is this. Family isn't just about blood and DNA. Real family is about love, respect, support, and seeing each other's true value. The people who share your genes might not be capable of giving you those things, and that's not your fault. You're allowed to walk away from toxicity, even when it wears the mask of family. You're allowed to demand repayment when you've been exploited. You're allowed to tell your truth, even when it makes people uncomfortable. I spent 34 years trying to earn a place in a family that never had room for me. Now I'm building my own family of choice, friends who celebrate my successes, a partner who sees my worth, mentors who encourage my growth, a community that values authenticity over appearances. And for the first time in my life, I feel like I belong somewhere real. To everyone watching who's still trapped in a similar situation, still giving pieces of yourself to people who don't appreciate them, still hoping that if you just try hard enough you'll finally be accepted, please hear me when I say this. You deserve better. You deserve people who see your value without you having to constantly prove it. You deserve to keep the fruits of your labor instead of funding other people's lifestyles. You deserve the truth, even when it's painful. That manila envelope I carried into that dinner contained more than just documents. It contained my liberation, my truth, my refusal to accept another day of lies and exploitation. And walking out of that house, despite the chaos and pain and burned bridges, was the best decision I ever made. I stopped being their victim and became the author of my own story. Thanks for watching, and remember, you're not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm, even if those people are family. Take care of yourselves out there, and I'll see you in the next video.